not have the originals. We don't have the first copies of the original. We don't even have copies of the copies or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. It's a great statement. You could almost put it to music, I think. And Ehrman has a great style of writing that says, oh my gosh, that just creates panic. I mean, I'm going to be skeptical about the text now. C.J. Werleman, who wrote the book Jesus Lied, makes a statement that sometimes we don't even have manuscripts till the 20th generation of copies. He just totally made that up out of thin air, but the rest of what he's saying, he borrows from Ehrman. And so if a story is worth telling, it's worth embellishing. And he's talking about Jesus lied? Give me a break. So I would say that may or may not be the case, but let me give you 6 ways to respond to this. First of all, in 2015, in the Bulletin of Biblical Review, Craig Evans, a really decent New Testament scholar, wrote an article called How Long Were Late Antique Books in Use? Now, this was based on some work by George Houston that had recently come out, where Houston examined 50 ancient libraries where there still was some material intact. And what he discovered was that literary papyri, that is, of literature that was meant to be read, not receipts or individual letters from a dad to a son or contracts for an apartment or things like that, but something that was meant to be of some literary value, often lasted hundreds of years. And the average was about 150 years. And so Evans takes from this that it's possible for a copy of the New Testament that could be maybe a century later than the originals to have been a copy directly of the originals. It's a really good argument. And one of the things that Ehrman says in his Misquoting Jesus is he says, well, we don't know how the originals got lost. I think we have a pretty good sense. They were copied so much that they got worn out from the copies. And that's the surest way we can get back to the original. It's not that somebody took them and burned them. We don't have evidence of the ancient church burning manuscripts. They didn't destroy them like that. Typically, if it got worn out, they would bury it. And so that's the first thing I would argue, is that they would last a lot longer. So you might have what might be a 3rd or 4th generation scribe copying from the original or copying from a 1st generation copy. In fact, we have one manuscript, as I mentioned earlier, that is from the 10th century copying from a 4th century manuscript, directly from that 4th century manuscript. That kind of thing did happen. Secondly, there was no central control over the copying of the New Testament like there was with the Quran. With the Quran, you had Caliph Uthman, who comes a few decades after Muhammad. He gathers up all the Qurans that had been done, and they were all over the place in terms of the variants, and he has all of them destroyed. So it's, this Quran, my Quran, is now the official one. So that basically reinvented Islam. And here you have M.M. al-Azmi, who says that the early church destroyed all these copies of the New Testament that had different Christologies or different views of Christ, so that now they would all conform to one view, and he thinks that that happened in Constantinople in the 4th century. Well, the problem is that we know that's what happened with Islam, his religion, but it didn't happen with the New Testament, because there was no central control that said, here's how the copy must be done, and we're going to conform it to this. We're going to destroy earlier copies. We don't have that. So the New Testament is quite a bit unlike the Quran. Third, I'd say at the same time, there was a group of scribes that didn't say, we're going to get rid of these variants and have these, but they had an intention of making as exact, accurate, precise, correct copies as they possibly could. These were the Alexandrian scribes. Alexandria was the most famous city in the ancient Greco-Roman world for careful copying of manuscripts, starting in the 2nd century BC. There were basic rules that they followed on this, and what we see in typically our best manuscripts are those that come from Alexandria or around there. The Christians were certainly influenced by this Alexandrian tradition. And even Bart Ehrman, in his book with Bruce Metzger, The Text of the New Testament, argues that the Alexandrian manuscripts are an exception to the more chaotic manuscripts we have early on, and that they are very accurate copies of a very accurate tradition that goes back to a very ancient time. He doesn't say that in Misquoting Jesus, but in his scholarly writing, he does. So then I'd also say a 4th argument, which probably, this may be the most important argument here. When Ehrman says we don't even have copies of the original for 4 generations, let's compare that to any other ancient Greco-Roman literature, anything. And what you discover is that with the New Testament, we have copies that come as early as within decades of when the original New Testament was written. We have as many as a dozen papyri from the 2nd century, at least of those that have been published so far. There may be more coming. We also have a lot more manuscripts in the 3rd century and 4th century, and even before the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. We have as many as 60 or 65 manuscripts, and you can reconstruct the whole New Testament from these early manuscripts. Now, let's compare that to the average Greco-Roman author of the time. The average classical author, we're talking about averages, would have fewer than 15 copies of his book still in existence today. And the average time gap from when that scholar, or when that author wrote until we have copies is close to 1,000 years. The time gap for the New Testament, decades. For the average classical author, 1,000 years. How many manuscripts do we have of the New Testament? Close to 6,000 in Greek alone. And it's somewhere between 20 and 25,000 when you count all the ancient versions. And so we've got approximately 1,000 times as much material or more than the average classical author has. And we have manuscripts that come on average 1,000 years earlier than the average classical author does. For example, take Xenophon, who is not an average classical author, but a well-known historian, and his book Hellenica. We don't have any copies of any substantial size until 1,800 years later. And yet scholars of Xenophon don't say, we just give up our hands, we have no idea what Hellenica originally said. They say, this is what we've got to work with, let's see what we can reconstruct. And sure, there's going to be a lot of gaps, and there's going to be things that they're just not sure what the original text said. But if our New Testament were in that same kind of a situation, it would be like saying the earliest substantial copy of the New Testament that we had was written about the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Now, that's when the skeptics would have a field day. When it comes to the New Testament, compared to any classical author, we have manuscripts that come significantly closer in time, and we have significantly more manuscripts. So in terms of the material evidence, we should be 1,000 times more confident about what the original text of the New Testament said than we should of virtually any classical author. That's really significant. And I would say, let me just give 2 other arguments quickly. It's not just the manuscripts that we're looking at, in Greek manuscripts, but it's also ancient versions. The New Testament was translated early on, late 2nd century, into Latin and then into Coptic and Syriac and Georgian and Gothic, Ethiopic, other languages. And those versions and church fathers' quotations of the New Testament, starting in the late 1st century, are so massive that we have kind of a triangulation of material to point us back to what the original text says. And I would finally say that Bart Ehrman knows better. It's the confluence of external and internal evidence, all this evidence from the versions, the fathers, and the manuscripts, from various parts of the Mediterranean region, from Alexandrian texts especially, but not exclusively, and internal evidence that where we're comparing the regions, we can say this region gave rise to these, like I mentioned in Romans 8:1, that can enable us to recover the original wording, which is what he dedicated his scholarly life to until he became skeptical about all this in the last few years. First of all, to think that a non-professional scribe is going to be sloppy has been proved false by C.H. Roberts. He published in 1977 a book dealing with Christian manuscripts in Egypt. This was his Schweik lectures at Oxford University. And Roberts discovered that of ancient Greek literature, you never had literary professional scribes abbreviate numbers. They would always write out the word for the number. But New Testament scribes often, early on, abbreviated them. Later on, they wrote them out. When it was professional scribes only who were copying, they wrote the words out. But they used the abbreviations to start with. And he said the only other group of writers that he's seen that do that are bean counters, bureaucrats, people who are running the ledgers and making sure everything lines up. Those are the least creative people on the planet. Now, I don't mean to impugn CPAs and other folks like that, but you have a left brain that's massive, and the right brain, well, sometimes it's shrinking, it's atrophying. I know some who are creative, but that's not what they do when they are copying out texts. These people were trying to be accurate. So if you have a non-professional scribe, we know the kind of non-professional scribe that we usually have, which is going to be that kind of person, a bureaucrat. He's non-professional because he doesn't make uniform-sized letters. That's how you determine if a scribe is professional. If he follows the notional line, and only certain letters can be above the line, some below. But that's how you can tell. Non-professional scribes, though, we tell that, and we notice that there's often a correspondence between their non-professional hand and abbreviating the letters, which is really, I think, significant. That's not the kind of person who's going to create textual variants that are intentional. Secondly, I would say if they're careless, as Ehrman says, and they make unintentional mistakes, he full well knows that that's the kind of textual variant that is the most easily detected. For example, if we had handwritten manuscripts of the Constitution, and I saw one, and I only saw one, and it said, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion," I'd say, that's a mistake. It's not supposed to be onion. Everybody knows it's cucumber. I mean, it's supposed to be union. And you see that mistake, you correct it. Peter Gurry, who is a former intern of mine, just got his doctorate at Cambridge University on textual criticism. He wrote an article about how many variants there are in the New Testament manuscripts. And one of the things he noted, which was very significant, is when you have these mistakes that are careless mistakes, they are found in one manuscript. They're not repeated. And so that creates what's called singular readings. A bonehead mistake, that scribe made it and nobody else. It doesn't get copied. Now, every once in a while they do if it's careless and it makes sense, but not if it doesn't make sense. And those are the ones that are easiest to detect. When Bart and I debated, we've debated 3 times, and when we debated at Southern Methodist University in 2011, I pointed out that some of these non-professional scribes actually create a much more accurate text. And I talked about the difference between Papyrus 75 and Papyrus 66, or P75 and P66. P66 is a manuscript written about AD 200. It has the Gospel of John. P75, written a little bit later, early 3rd century, it has Luke and John in it. And P66, the scribe there was wholly consumed with making beautiful letters. And so he leaves out words here and there. He'll add words. He doesn't seem to be that concerned with accuracy, but then he has to come back later and he makes 450 corrections to his manuscript. The scribe of P66 is not a professional scribe. His handwriting is just not nearly as elegant as P66's. And he copies out one letter at a time. And we know this because the only kinds of mistakes he makes are transpositions of 2 letters, or of dropping a letter, or adding a letter. That manuscript has become one of the most important, one of the most accurate manuscripts we have of the New Testament, done by a non-professional or not as professional scribe as P66. A few years ago, it was owned by the Bodmer family in Geneva, and they were renovating their museum, their library, and they needed more money to renovate it, apparently. So they sold this manuscript, which I think was a mistake because it was the best manuscript they had in the whole museum. And Yale University, for this 3rd century papyrus that just has most of Luke and most of John, offered them $50 million. And they turned them down and sold it to the Vatican for an undisclosed price. That's how important this manuscript is. Now, I think what's significant about it is that a professional scribe, the scribe who wrote this manuscript, Codex Vaticanus, in the 4th century, has greater agreement with P75 than any other manuscript. In fact, these 2 manuscripts have greater agreement with each other than any other manuscripts through the first 800 years of the Christian era. And yet, we know that this manuscript is not a copy of P75 because there's places that it has more original readings, that is, earlier readings that we know that P75 must have copied from a tradition that defects the text, creates defections in the text a little bit more, which means that both of them, when they agree, which is most of the time, go back to a very, very early text that was very accurately produced, probably one that's in the first or second decade of the 2nd century. This is a facsimile of Codex Vaticanus. The real manuscript is in the Vatican, as the name might imply. It was a manuscript that was first recognized to exist in 1475 when the Vatican produced its first catalog of its library, and this manuscript was already in there. It's never been something that has been tucked away in a secret room, but it's not always been available for scholars to examine. And finally, in the late 19th century, the text of it was published, but scholars had been able to see it, like Samuel Prideaux Tregelles saw it for a few days and wrote down a number of the variants that it had. But even Erasmus in the early 1500s wrote to a friend and said, at 1 John 5, 7, and 8, he said, there's some people who say the wording should be the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, these three are one. And he said, I don't have any manuscripts that have that. And he said, does this manuscript, I know it's your maybe one of your oldest, perhaps your oldest manuscript. They didn't know how to date manuscripts back then. He said, does this have it? And his friend said, no, it's not in this manuscript. There's no evidence of it. So it's a manuscript that's been known for a long, long time. And it has most of the Old Testament and most of the New Testament. It ends at Hebrews 9:13, and that's because it's a codex, like our modern books. This is a codex, where it's bound on one side. You have 3 sides that are open, cut pages. That form was invented in the second half of the 1st century A.D. And Vaticanus, by the 4th century, you could make these books big enough to contain the entire Bible. We have 2 of them still today, Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, which is our oldest complete New Testament. And this may be one of those 2 Bibles that Emperor Constantine commissioned to be built or written by Eusebius in his workshop in Caesarea by his scribes. Because Constantine, in the life of Constantine, we read that it says, Eusebius says, he ordered these manuscripts to be produced in 3s and 4s. There's a dozen different interpretations of those, but T.C. Skeat, who was the curator at the British Library for many years, said he thinks it means 3 and 4 columns. This is the only 3-column Greek New Testament manuscript we have of the first millennium. Sinaiticus is the only 4-column Greek New Testament manuscript we have of any century, of any date. These are the only 3s and 4s from the 4th century. So after Hebrews 9:13, you can notice, you get to the end of this, we're still in this manuscript, and then you notice here the handwriting has changed. Maybe you can't see it too well, but this is, right here is the change. This is block script, this is cursive hand, done several centuries later to fill out this manuscript because the last few leaves were lost from just centuries of use. That's what happens with codices. So it's a great manuscript, really, really important. And I have it open to the ending of Mark's Gospel, where the final column has nothing here. And then the next page begins with Luke's Gospel. And there has been a lot of speculation as to why there's nothing in that final column. There have been some who have said there's no other manuscript that has, or there's no other place in Vaticanus that has a column that's blank. That's not true, actually, because it's a whole Bible. You look at the columns in the Old Testament, and there's 3 places where it's blank. And it has a very strong tendency to put a blank column when the next book is a shift in genre. Now, what's interesting is the next book here is Luke. That's the same genre, Gospels. But some scholars, and I'm inclined to believe this, believe that once the codex form was invented and started to be used in the 2nd century, where you could actually put a whole Gospels text and even more in a single codex, Mark would have been the last gospel. And the order would have been called what's now known as the Western order: Matthew, John, Luke, and Mark. Our oldest manuscript that has all four Gospels, P45 from the early 3rd century, has the Western order in it. So do a number of others. They put the apostles first, then Luke because he's an associate with Paul's, and then Mark because he's the last, the least important, they thought, and the shortest. And by putting a blank column here, that meant that what came next would be the book of Acts, a genre shift. We have very firm evidence in this particular manuscript that he rearranges the order of the books from the manuscript that he's copying from. When he gets into Paul's letters, he puts Galatians in a different order and Hebrews in a different order from where they were in the copy. There's ways you can tell he numbers the paragraphs, and the numbers are out of sequence. So I think what he may be doing here is actually copying the formatting of the exemplar without having the same meaning. So he's put Mark in a different order, but the exemplar had a blank column there because Acts would have followed. An exemplar means the manuscript that you're copying from. So it's the original, if you will, the original for that particular scribe. Emperor Constantine had zero role in the transmission of the Greek text, except to ask Eusebius to make 50 Bibles. But he didn't tell him what was going to go in those Bibles. In fact, Constantine has been accused of doing all sorts of things to corrupt Christianity. In Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, Sir Lee Teabing is talking to Sophie at his home in France, and he says, until that moment, and he meant the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, Jesus was viewed as a man, a mortal, just a human, not deity. And he essentially argues that Constantine invented the deity of Christ. Now, Dan Brown gets that from this book this novel authored by 3 British novelists, and he really believed that, Constantine must have invented the deity of Christ. In that novel, the British folks they said there are no New Testament manuscripts prior to the Council of Nicaea. None. Which simply means that they did not do any homework. They're just making things up out of thin air. But they believe it. I mean, it's a historical novel. They try to promote this kind of stuff just like Dan Brown thinks his is a historical novel. We have as many as 65 manuscripts just in Greek alone prior to the Council of Nicaea. We have a lot of church fathers who comment on Scripture, and they have full commentaries on various books. We have versions. We have just tons of material prior to the 4th century. And here's what I would say is, William Lane, on his desk when he was teaching at Seattle Pacific University, had just a little motto that he lived by: an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. And let me give you an ounce of evidence that goes against this presumption that is a really popular myth that Constantine changed the Greek New Testament so that now affirm the deity of Christ and other doctrines. Let me go back to P66, AD 200 approximately, maybe a little bit earlier. At John 1:1, it says what every single manuscript, no matter what language, says: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is written about 125 years before the Council of Nicaea. Now, unless Constantine was maybe 150 years old when that council convened, I rather doubt that he invented the deity of Christ. And you have church fathers, and you have the apostolic fathers, and you have manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. When you compare all these texts, there's not a single doctrine that is jeopardized by any of these viable variants. And there's zero evidence that Constantine changed the text of the New Testament or even dictated what the books of the New Testament should be. Because Eusebius, that's the other myth that is spread about Constantine. Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, which we know was written before the Council of Nicaea, he has in Book 3, Chapter 15, a description of 4 categories of books that could potentially be canonized as New Testament. He has Homilegumena, Antilegomena, Pseudepigrapha, and Apocrypha. The Homilegumena becomes a technical name for those books that have been accepted unanimously with a chain of tradition going all the way back to the first century in the 5 major churches of the ancient world. There's unanimous testimony from bishop down to bishop. Yeah, this is authentic. This guy wrote it. And that is 22 of the New Testament books, are the Homologona. The Antilegomena are those books that were accepted by most of the churches, but they don't have unanimous testimony, and those are the rest of the New Testament books. Then you've got the pseudepigrapha, which are books that are attributed to certain authors, but they're not by those people. Those, anytime the church discovered that, they always rejected those books. And then you have the apocrypha, which are hidden books and things that were just rejected because they were heretical. Here, before Constantine issued the commission to Eusebius in 332 to produce these Bibles, Constantine already had said, here are the 27 books that we would consider the New Testament. He had to know what books to put in the New Testament, and he knew that before he ever had any contact with Constantine at all.